Ciao everybody. So today we're going to be speaking about Design 101, so the basic concepts. I'm getting just home after a long day of tattooing, but I figured it would be nice to get into this. I'm actually getting very excited as I can start doing these educations with the PDFs combined. So I think as we proceed, everything's going to get better and better and better. And I'm very happy with the feedback that I'm getting from you guys. It helps me develop as well as a teacher, so thank you for that. Okay, let's dive straight in. Now we really want to understand the basic concepts of designing because it's going to help us make a lot better artwork. And I think it doesn't only help us make better artwork, it helps us become much better artists as well. Because understanding how to design, understanding all these concepts that we're going to go through now, even if they're very basic, it's going to help train our eye. And I always think that we as artists, we can only be as good as we have trained our eye to be. So what we can't see, we can't really tattoo either. And if we train our eye, meaning also our mind, that we understand what we're looking at, we understand why it looks off, why it doesn't look off, it really helps us as artists because we can start being much more critical to our own artwork. And I remember when I started tattooing, I was looking up at so many artists. And obviously I still do look up at a lot of artists, but many artists that I looked up on, maybe a year later when I had picked up a lot of information and started seeing some differences, tattoos actually weren't that good. They weren't crisp, they weren't saturated, they were sloppy here and there, rushed through, whatever it may have been. But it was something that my untrained eye just couldn't catch. I would hope and invite all of you to take this very seriously because it's going to help you so much in building a career that's going to open up a million doors for you. Pay attention, and after that, reflect a little bit and start thinking about what we actually went through here. And not only that, but the next few weeks after you watch this, start paying attention in your own artwork, whatever artwork you're looking at, start paying attention to the things that we went through here. And if you need to, you come back to this and so forth. This is the best way of learning, and this is how you actually implement all of this information into your brain. Okay, let's start. I would define design as the plan you have for creating your artwork, how you plan your artwork to be. Having a plan really helps you create the best possible artwork. Obviously, there's some freedom also, and you should be very free when you're creating, but just setting some kind of a plan, understanding what kind of canvas you have, how big it is, how many details you want to fit there. If it's a large canvas, maybe you fit some more details, but you don't want to make it too crowded either. So if it's a small canvas, maybe you don't make it full of details, so forth. You want to have a plan of what kind of story you tell before you start painting. Obviously, you can also paint just on the go and see what happens. But I think, especially as tattoo artists, we have clients, we want to present something. So having some kind of an idea of what we're going to be doing helps a lot. And if we know how we're supposed to put this idea into place to make it the best possible end result, then that's going to go a long way in creating something absolutely amazing. So we're going to go into a few design elements that we can use when we're creating our designs and some principles, as well as the basic concepts around composition. So some elements of design can be color, texture, lines, value, etc. We're going to go through each of these now here step by step. So we start with lines. Now this is something that most of you will be using when you're tattooing. As a artist who works mainly with realism, I'm not really working with a lot of lines. It's more sharp shadows, soft shadows, transitions, etc. But obviously there are some lines, but the core concept when people think about tattoos is usually line work. So obviously we have a lot of different types of lines. In tattoos, usually the very basic line that we see is of an even width. So it's very monotone, right? We can have straight lines, curved lines, or dotted lines. If you look at nowadays at some cartoons, you will see that a lot of lines also are kind of dynamic. So they have a different weight. They're not monotone. They're not the same thickness, but we actually have a flow within the line. Not just a line curving, but the line actually starts from being wide and ends up in a very, very tiny tip. So this way we can create a very dynamic image and even have dynamics inside the line work itself. Obviously, the use of lines can also help guide the viewer's eye. So whoever's watching the artwork, we can use lines in a way that we catch the eye of the viewer and transition it into one specific point of the artwork. With lines, we can also create the feeling of movement, everything like this. And so lines are one element that we can be using when we're doing our designs. We obviously have other shapes, such as geometric shapes, which are usually very regular, such as triangles, circles, or squares, what have you. We have organic shapes, which are irregular, more naturally occurring. And we can use a lot of these shapes in forming the foundation of our design, depending on what we want to create. Now with all these shapes and lines, we can start creating forms, creating the illusion of three-dimensionality, where we have different values, hues, and colors that create the illusion of depth, illusion of form, illusion of volume. So as you think of a 2D object, we don't really think of shadows on a 2D object in the same way as we think of a 3D object, where the light hits and some surfaces are actually going to be in the light, some are going to be in the shadow, and so forth. Well, we have positive and negative space. These are two words that I want to teach you now because they might come up at later stages also in your career. So positive space usually refers to the elements of interest in the artwork, whereas negative space often refers to the elements that are not of interest, but they're going to be complementary and they're going to be needed for each other. So negative space could be something such as the background, or if we're tattooing, we can leave what we call negative space in the skin. And the usage of this can in turn create the feeling of space where we have something in the foreground, something more in the background. We can create the feeling of space by overlapping, having something in front, something in back, something even more further in the back, and so forth. And obviously the use of perspective, where things further away start looking smaller, things closer to you start being larger. Color is obviously an element we use when we're designing. And we already discussed the basics of color and how to use it in your designs. So really understanding color, if that's something you're going to be implementing in your artwork, is crucial. As we already discussed, we don't want to make something scream. We don't want to make something too colorful. We want to use it tastefully. We want to know when we're using very high chroma colors, when not, how we're playing with value, how we're playing with different color families, how they function with each other, etc. And in colors, we haven't gone into color harmonies so much yet, but we will. And color harmonies is pretty much how you're going to be combining different families of colors to create some kind of harmony in your artwork. So some colors work way better with each other than others. And there are some rules or kind of guidelines on how to combine colors to create the best possible outcome and feeling in your artwork. So another element we can use is texture, or even lack thereof. And we have visual texture, and then when we're painting, we even have tactile texture, which means that we're having thick layers of paint or something like that, that we can actually touch and feel that it's different. And visuals are, again, just when we're playing with some texture that is visually there. Obviously, when we're tattooing, we're not going to be playing with tactile texture, just with visual texture. We can use texture to grab interest. If we have one area in the artwork which has a lot more texture than the rest, then probably the interest or the viewer's eye is going to catch this point first. And we can even create the illusion of depth, where some artists use this very nicely, where they have really textured and sharp in the like close-ups, but everything further out is blur, or vice versa. You see this a lot with photographers, but also you see a lot of artists who implement this a lot in their work, and it really works nicely. Then obviously value, which by now should be very familiar for all of you guys. I would even argue that this is one of the most crucial parts in any artwork, is to add value and create some kind of contrast in your artwork. Now, I don't remember whose quote this was. I think it was Leonardo da Vinci. He said, "You can make decent art by creating value and having the darkest and lightest tones." Correct. But when you start nailing also the middle tones, that's when you become a really good artist. And I can say this is really true because I see, especially, let's talk black and gray tattoos for a while. So I see a lot of really good black and gray artists, but majority of them are not really good, because their mid-tones are okay, but they're lacking the slightest nuances which makes a big difference, and this difference separates them from the really good artists. So it's easy to nail the really darks, it's easy to nail the really lights, and some in between colors, and your artwork is already gonna look okay. But when you start really paying attention to the most subtle differences, that's when your artwork becomes from good to really, really, really good. It's a slight difference, but this is also just training the eye to start seeing those really tiny, small nuance differences. And if you want to achieve these differences, then obviously you need to nail down your techniques as well. It's not just only about training your eye, but you need to have the proper techniques to create very, very subtle differences. And the techniques vary obviously from what art form you're dealing with. So if you're dealing with charcoal, you might use a brush to make it softer. If you're dealing with tattoos, you might choose a specific needle that leaves a little bit less ink every time you touch the skin. You might be a little bit lighter with your touch. You might be using a more diluted ink. Whatever your choice of weapon might be to create these smooth shadows or very, very tiny nuance differences, you need to nail those down if you want to become really, really, really good. And we will go into a lot of tattoo techniques that are going to help you out a lot. But for now, we're still just talking about design. There's a few different ways of creating balance in your artwork. What balance really means is that your artwork is not left heavy or right heavy or top heavy or bottom heavy. And what this means is we have a few elements in the artwork that demand attention. And if all of these elements are placed to one specific point in the artwork, it's going to feel very, very out of balance, right? So a good rule when designing is to try to keep some kind of balance in your artwork. This means not to create all of the elements of interest into one specific area, but it should be balanced out, right? So I'm going to show you some visuals so you understand what I'm meaning. And with balance, we have a few different things, such as symmetrical. This is easy for everybody to understand. Symmetrical means just that it's very, very equally on both sides, or whether it's flipped up and down. But symmetrical balance just means it's pretty much exactly the same on the left side and the right side. Now, asymmetrical still means that it's in balance, but it means that what we have on the left side or right side or up and down might be different elements, but they still kind of balance the artwork out because they have a similar interest depending on their placement in the artwork. If it makes sense. If it doesn't, then again ask questions and I try to make it clearer in an upcoming video under the same module. And then we have also radial balance, which means pretty much that we have balance in all directions, maybe like a center point, and the balance spreads out throughout the artwork. So to simplify, having balance, it's the distribution of the overall visual weight in the image. And now if you're looking at this image, you clearly see that the majority of weight is on the right side. So this is clearly tilting towards the right, this image. And if we want to be perfectionist, we would rather move the red square more to the left and the yellow square much more to the left. Or even change them to be exactly of the same size and form and have them on equal distances. But so this image obviously is not in balance, right? A very, very simplified example so you will really understand what I mean. So these boxes and triangles and lines are elements, right? Visual elements in the artwork. And they should be in balance. We're going to go into some more complex examples soon so you'll understand how to actually incorporate it into artwork, yeah? So here's an example, again a simple example of a more balanced image. And now a few factors that contribute to the visual weight of an element is going to be the size, the shape, the color, the value, texture, etc. So we might even have something like a face, which is going to draw all the attention. So if you have three faces down in the right lower corner, and on the left side you have, let's say, three blue flowers, but the background is blue as well, then all the attention is going to still go to those faces, and it's going to be not in a balanced picture. So some elements carry more of a weight than others, let's say like this. Yeah. Now let me show you also a few images. Let me pick them up from here. So here you see on the left you see symmetrical balance, and on the right you see asymmetrical balance, right? So you understand what that is now. But they're both in balance. And here's a good example of radial balance. So everything spreads out pretty much from the center, and it spreads out fairly symmetrically, right? So this is what we would call radial balance. Okay, back to the slides, guys. So here's an example where pretty much the only interest in this, I wouldn't even call it artwork, I just made a very shitty example for you guys so you really understand. So here you see pretty much all of the weight is going to be in the left corner, left lower corner, because that's the only element of any interest. Everything else is just blurred down. So it just doesn't fit. It needs to have some balance in the right upper corner or in the middle or whatever. But this is just way left bottom heavy. And one easy way for you, if you're not sure if your image is in balance, is you can just try to bump up the contrast to check if the image is in balance or not. So here's a good example where you just bump it up and you see the majority of the elements of interest, which is going to be created pretty much by the difference in value right now, is going to be below the midline of the image. So in order to make the image more in balance, perhaps an element of interest could be somewhere in the more towards the upper right corner as well, just to balance it out again. Now, it doesn't mean that all images have to be in perfect balance, but it helps. It helps in creating an image that's nice to look at. So how can we create contrast or create demand of looking at somewhere in the picture? We can create it by color, we can create it by value, which is the very basic definition of actual contrast. But again, when we're speaking about contrast, it just means the difference. Now, yeah, so it can be a difference in color, which means that one color is screaming way louder than another one, right? So this is going to create high contrast. It can be texture, where we have a lot of texture or little texture next to each other. It can be certain different elements. It can be the sharpness of the image, the blurriness of the image next to it. It can be movement that catches the attention, and stationary parts of the image where nothing moves, and one part where everything moves, and then immediately the attention is going to go to where everything moves. So this is how we create kind of interest in the image, by using contrast. And as said, we can create contrast with many different ways that we just discussed here now: color, value, texture, element, sharpness, movement. There's a million different ways to create contrast in an image. And now when we say contrast, I do not mean only value, just contrast, which is going to mean that something is different and therefore it stands out in the image. So how do we create emphasis in an image? We already discussed this, but what we call usually these objects of interest or places of interest in an artwork is focal points. So these are made to draw the attention of the viewer to this specific area in the artwork. Now, how do we create focal points? I will show you a lot of different examples. And again, if you have more questions after this, do not be afraid to ask, because we're here to learn, I'm here to teach, so all the questions are welcome. Okay, so the slides are jumping a little bit, but focal points, the areas or objects that the viewer is drawn to immediately, as we discussed. What's important is keep the number of focal points limited, because we do not want to have an artwork where every single part of the artwork just screams for attention. Again, same as the saturated or overly saturated image, it's not good if everything in the artwork screams for attention. It's better to choose where and when. And that's why when we're dealing with clients, as we're tattooing, we need to know when to say no. I'm fairly sure that most of you know that a lot of clients have ideas of incorporating 10 or 20 different things into a sleeve or whatever. It's usually just way too many elements into a small space, and it usually does not work. So as artists, we need to also be able to be professional enough. At least when we know what we're talking about, we need to be professional enough to say no when we know it's not going to work. And that's why we're also learning here, because when you understand this stuff, you're going to have a much easier way of saying no, and you can even explain why, right? Okay, so focal point, one example as we spoke was about creating contrast. For example, textural, color or value differences. Now here's a very easy example. Where does the attention go? It goes to the red bus because everything else is pretty neutral color, right? We also have some guidelines that we already spoke about. We have some line work, but we have a few lines that go along the street and they're clearly pointing towards the bus also. So we have a lot of these guidelines. Even Big Ben, the big tower there, is standing right above the bus, which is also kind of guiding the eye there. So pretty much everything here is designed to create the attention on the red bus. Now, another way of creating contrast is just by having a very different value. So here we pretty much have two different focal points. One is clearly the green tomato, and the secondary is then to look at all the rest of the tomatoes. But the main focal point here is the green tomato, just because it's of a different color than the red ones. It stands out from the artwork. We can also create focal points by just isolating one part of the artwork. As we see here, we have one coin standing separate from the rest of the coins, so the attention goes there first, and the secondary focal point is then the bunch of coins here. Then we can also create focal points by just placing the object of interest in the very middle of the artwork. And here actually I think it's done very nicely because we have contrast in light and dark. We have very light flower, and behind it we have a darker face. The artist has also created contrast by having a very sharp flower in the front and a blurred image in the back. And this way the artist has also created depth and the feeling of space in the artwork. Here's another example of just a center image. So we have a clear focal point. Another thing that actually really well works as a focal point is a human face, because naturally our mind is drawn to things that we recognize, that we know. And what do we recognize more than anything else pretty much is a human face or some kind of an object that is familiar for us. Here's again a good example of line work or converging lines that really guide the attention. Obviously we also have a centered image. We have something standing out and he's even in movement, but you see the clear guidelines, you see the convergence. And here again actually we have what we called perspective, which we went through in the very beginning. When something is further away from you, it gets smaller, and so you see the trains. When you look at them, they actually converge to this midpoint, but the further you look, the smaller the train gets. And this is what we call perspective, which probably is familiar to most of you, but just to remind. Now, another way to create focal points, or pretty much the same way as we just did, is to create some kind of curves or something that leads us to the place we want to see, which here would be the sun. But you see, the entire road moves the viewer's eye directly to the focal point. Obviously, the focal point will immediately still be a focal point because it stands out as something recognizable and something that actually is different from the rest of the image, which is now the burning sun here in the background. But what helps is to have something that leads the viewer's eye there as well. And here in this case, it's the road. Here's an example of a tattoo we did quite a long time ago. It was for artists me, Katlin, Adrian and Mori. I think this was one of the first artworks where we started actually blurring the background. I think we could have done a much better job on it. But anyway, so we as you see the chains, they get blurry more in the background, and yeah, this is stuff that you can also do in tattoos. And obviously the red nose will also help in creating in drawing attention, as well as does the face with textures and less textures in the background. Now we got motion, obviously. You see the only thing here moving is the kid, but plus he also stands out from the background, so we have another focal point. If any of you think that something else in this image is a focal point, then please tell me, but like it couldn't be more obvious that this is the very thing in the image that the eye is going to be drawn to. I would suggest now when you start creating your artwork, figure out where in the artwork do you want to create the first point of attention. If your artwork is not something where you feel comfortable incorporating what we're talking about right now, or if it's just not, easy to incorporate what we have talked about here, then at least do yourself a favor and study some artwork that exists out there and try to see the things that we have been talking about here today. Another way of creating a focal point is by framing it, by having something around an object. So framing is a very powerful tool, and we can do it. Here's a very good example also. So we have something very blurred in the front ground, and then we have the sharper gorilla face in the middle. And here the blurred leaves act as a frame, and immediately all the attention is only going to go to the gorilla face. There's really nothing else to look at here. Now, if you would want to go absolutely apeshit crazy, then you could color the eyes like bright red and turn down the chroma on everything else and just increase the textures. But sometimes too much is too much. So here we have something that's nicely nicely in balance when it comes to blur, sharp, colors, everything. Now another artwork that I actually found, can't remember where I found it. I'm sorry, if somebody knows the artist, let me know and I will give them credit. But this artwork really shows like great know-how of what they're doing. You can see all the curved lines that just automatically create kind of flows for the viewer to start looking at the face. Now this red line is drawn by me so that you can really see what kind of artwork the artist created to really draw your attention to the face. Then the face is obviously going to be of great interest as well. Plus the face is of a color that really stands out from the background, and the face is lighter than the background, and we got red lips. There's just a lot here that really draws the attention to the face. Now, if we look at another image, some person might like this. I personally do not. And there's a few reasons. I think, first of all, it's just way too high chroma for me. Everywhere it's just screaming colors. The second part is that there's really just my eye wanders around the image too much. There's nothing where my eye really rests and looks at the image in peace. And obviously this is all, depending on who's looking at the image and what kind of feelings, emotions it awakes in you. But for me, there's really nothing to rest my eye on. It's just screaming. There's nothing peaceful about the image. Maybe that's the whole idea. Maybe that's the point of the artwork. I value artwork that has this classical sense, harmony. They kind of follow some rules, but not to be strict with rules, but they understand what makes a good work of art. Now, obviously, these are just opinions and there's nothing like super strict about artwork, but a lot of these tools that I'm showing you today or we're talking about, they really help to create artwork that the majority of people will really enjoy looking at, And I think you can all agree, when we talked about balance, for example, just putting all the interest into one corner of the image, at some point it might actually work and then you can use it, but most of the time it does not. So these are really good guidelines to understand. And same with the overly saturated images or just all the things we're talking about here. Like, think of them as tools that will really help you. They're not there to restrict you. They're there to help you create something better. Yeah. So you don't have to become a slave to everything we're talking about here today, but I really suggest that you really learn it, you understand it, because it can really help you in creating much better artwork and to see where you should improve in your artwork. Now, obviously, it should still be fun. You should enjoy what you're doing, and I think it is, and it actually becomes more fun the more you know. Because when you can on purpose also break some rules just to create something extraordinary. Now to an image that I really, really enjoy looking at because I feel it's peaceful, even though maybe the subject of the image is not so peaceful for some people, but the actual visual aspect of it I think is very, very beautiful. It doesn't scream of too much color. It's very, very neutral with the background. You have some of the brighter colors on the magpie feathers. But overall, it's in great balance, it's in great harmony. It's just, for me, I feel like this is pretty much as close to a perfect image as somebody could ever do. So we got perfect weight distribution, which creates balance. There's a few different focal points, but they're all they make sense, right? So we have focal points are first the two birds around the prey, and then we got two other birds here on the side looking in. But all of these focal points, they kind of guide the viewer back into the image. So even if you would start from the two birds around the prey and then look into the other birds, those birds again look back to the first focal point. So the viewer's eye goes back there again. And maybe after that it wanders a little bit into the background and starts looking at the details and the small nuances and actually the depth and the softness of the moss with the textures, etc. So and you notice that some of the textures here in the prey bird, they are very sharp and higher contrast. And when you go to the moss, they're still sharp, but the high contrast in the textures is not there. So it's kind of like a softer feel to the texture. So it's not drawing too much attention. Okay, so I got a little bit excited because for me it's a really, really good artwork. This is from the von Wright brothers, Finnish painter brothers, who painted a lot of birds in their time, and I think it serves as a really good example. So here again, you see I draw some of the arrows, so you see how the bird's actually watching back in, and it kind of creates a loop for the viewer to keep looking at the image. Okay, then also designing according to your canvas, form and size, so kind of know your canvas. You usually want to leave enough room for the artwork to breathe and not constrict it too much. And movement we can use, as we already discussed, to draw the viewer to the artwork, one specific point, such as a focal point. We had the boy jumping up, for example. That's one good example of movement. We can use guidelines or elements to guide the eye through the artwork, which we saw with the road. And as we saw with the magpie, some guidelines can help the eye move to the second focal point or back into the painting and to the main focal point. But if you're using some of these guidelines, such as a road, for example, or a branch or anything else, if you're misplacing these and you don't know what you're doing, you might by mistake guide the viewer's eye out from the artwork, So when you know these things, you can place things in the artwork on purpose to put the viewer's eye back into the artwork. For me, this is what really makes us artists. When we know these things, we can play with them, It's kind of like somebody playing guitar. Like if you just know a few notes, but when you know how to use them in order to create a different feeling, or suddenly, let's say, slow down just so you can get the people calm and then bring them back in with something that hits heavy. So it's kind of the same way when we're creating art, like visual art. When we know these things, we can really use them to our advantage. And that's when we become real artists, We can really, really let our ideas flow. A few other principles of design, which is pattern. We can use some repeating elements to create some kind of rhythm or consistency. Rhythm is also like creating a sense of flow through repeated elements or variations of them. And unity is ensuring that all parts of the design work together. So this is, I think a good example is if I tell you a story about pretty much a lot of clients that I've had, is a lot of people have very weird ideas for what to incorporate in, let's say, a sleeve. Like there might be 4 completely different ideas. Like let's say it might be a nun smoking a pipe with a hummingbird, and perhaps they want a flower and a birth of date and a pocket watch. These are elements that they just simply do not belong together, and kind of creates a headache even to trying to put them together. So for me, unity comes from it all making some sort of sense. Now, obviously, it can also be used in a way where it does not make sense. Let's say like Dali's some weird paintings and stuff, surreal paintings. That's awesome. But they still work because they have unity in them because of their weirdness, But some stuff just is too weird to make it work, It just visually, they simply don't go together. Or at least for me, some things just feel too different to be able to make them into a nice, cohesive, united piece. So that's what unity is all about, making the piece kind of cohesive and tying it all together, making it look like it all belongs there. Even if it wouldn't make sense to belong there, at least it would look this way. So here's an example of patterns and a repeating pattern, pretty much even a rhythm, and we even get some kind of depth in this. But you see a repeating pattern, you see also that the artist uses a lot of the same objects. Some are turned different ways, but it's still pretty much repeating. This is what you will see a lot of on wallpapers or anything else like that. So for anybody who's dealing with geometrical tattoos or stuff like that, that's where we have a lot of repetition. And it works amazingly. But it can work not only in geometrical artwork, it can work in a lot of different artworks to have some repetition of elements and therefore like creating a rhythm. So here's a nice rhythm also, and we also have repetition. We have repetition of the small waves, We have repetition also slightly of larger waves, but pretty much I would kind of concentrate on having a lot of repetition on the smaller, on the breaking white parts of the wave. So, and this also creates a very nice rhythm. And as you see with the rhythm and also even repetitive patterns, like a Van Gogh. Here you see the stars, they're kind of repetitive. We have nice rhythm in the flow of the night sky. We pretty much have the same flow through most of the elements. And so here it's pretty much pattern, it's repetitiveness, it's nice rhythm, and it's even unity, because it all kind of ties together and makes sense. It's supposed to be in the same picture, and it makes for a cohesive image. And also the rhythm really lets the viewer stay in this picture and observe. And that's what I think actually makes some of his work so special, that he creates so much rhythm within the small details of his artwork that people stay there for a while. So composition, and under composition obviously falls balance as well, but composition is the placement or arrangement of visual elements in a work of art. Kind of think of it as when you're making a song, so the placement of notes. So now instead of notes, our elements would be some colors, values, forms, shapes, guidelines, whatever elements we want to use. As we went through elements already, but the composition part is in how we want to arrange them in the artwork to create a certain feeling or tell a story. So in composition, we need to concentrate on the focal point, which we already talked about: contrast, isolation, placement, convergence, blurring, motion, sharpness, faces, figures, framing, textures, whatever. It can be pretty much anything that creates some sense of look here feeling. Then in the composition, we also want to create some kind of balance. Perhaps we want to create movement, rhythm, unity. How do we want to structure the composition? There's a few rules for this, or again, as I want to call them, guidelines, not rules. But we have the rule of thirds, the golden ratio, pyramid, symmetry, full frame, etc. We're going to go through a few of these just so you get familiar with them. So it kind of means how you're going to place some of the focal points to make sense, right? So why do we need structure in the artwork? Structure is pretty much how you're placing the elements of interest in your artwork. And it's pretty crucial to have some kind of structure in your artwork, because otherwise it's kind of like having just a messy wardrobe, everything laying here and there. But if you have some kind of structure, it already immediately looks nicer. So do not be unorganized or random. Or if you want to be random with a specific purpose to be random. So usually any kind of structure is a lot better than no structure at all. But we're going to go through a few examples of good guidelines for structures. Again, I want to emphasize guidelines, not rules. It's up to you. The rule of third, I think this is pretty much familiar for a lot of artists already. The rule of thirds is pretty much you divide your canvas, whether it be an upper arm or a flat canvas like a painting, divide it in 3 sections horizontally and vertically. What you want to do then is you want to create your image or compose your image in a way where you would have one focal point at one intersection of these, so at 1/3. Now, to balance the image out, it would be good to have something of similar interest on another third, but it's not necessary. These are again just guidelines, but as you remembered when we talked about balance, it can help to balance the image out. Now, the golden ratio, it's fairly similar to the rule of thirds, but not really. This is something that all of you can read a lot more into if you need. I think it's a good tool, but it's not something you should invest your majority of time in. If you're beginning, there's a lot more things that you can use to your advantage to become a good artist. But I definitely think if you're at a point where you feel comfortable with pretty much everything you're doing, then you can start looking more into details like the golden ratio, which is pretty much something that's occurring everywhere in nature, this division. So needless to say, it's pleasing for the human eye to look at because we're so familiar with it. Pretty much everything we see in nature follows this rule. Then another way of structurizing things is placing them kind of in a pyramid. We can make it a pyramid that's laying on its bottom or an upside down pyramid. If it's an upside down pyramid, then the image is going to feel a little bit kind of dangerous in a way because it feels a little bit out of balance or like it could tip at any point in time. So these are just a few things that you can play with. Symmetry, which is, I think, for everybody, even in daily life, a very easy structure to understand. It's easy to look at. And we obviously have the Last Supper as a great example of symmetry, and also converging lines and perspective. Pretty much everything's here. In the middle, you see Jesus wearing the bright red, and he's even standing a little bit separate from the rest of the groups in the middle, having some space to his left and his right, compared to the other characters, thus drawing pretty much all the attention on him. He's also standing in front of one of these back windows, even more creating contrast on his face. Then we got full frame, which is pretty much just big image. And if you're doing this, I really suggest to pretty much blur down the background as much as possible, just to create a full focal point on the actual image, and then do not do a lot of details in the background. This is pretty much the same if you're using, let's say, an upper arm or a calf, whatever you're tattooing. If you're going to be using one big element, then do not put too much details in the background. It's not necessary. Similar to the clown back that we did, you know, just the face, it's enough that it's sharp, and you don't have to bring a lot more into it. But if it's a larger picture like this, you can bring a lot more detail also into it. But in the case of full frame, where we go just one big picture, I suggest keeping the background fairly simple, because we don't want to draw attention away from the main subject. So we return to lines and kind of curves, which is curved lines that we started this design 101 from. So we can use S curves and C curves. I'll see if I have an image on it. Yeah, here's a good example of it. You see we got C curves in the blue ones, and we got an S curve in the yellow one. But it creates a really nice flow through the landscape, and it kind of invites the viewer also to look at the different parts of the artwork. And I said we can also use the vanishing points, which we have seen a few different examples of here. We can use some diagonal lines as well. And we can even in the artwork, using diagonal lines will create much more of a dynamic feeling in the artwork. I'll see if I have some picture of this. Yeah, here. So diagonal lines usually create a much more interesting dynamic. As you see here, this is just feet and arms, but if it's just all horizontal, it doesn't create that much dynamic in the picture, that much of a dynamic feeling if we're just having a standstill kind of vertical or horizontal image. But here, if we're using these figures in a more diagonal way, we can create much more of a dynamic movement or feeling in the artwork. And here's again what we talked about, an image of the Last Supper, and how we can use vanishing points to kind of draw all our attention to the main character. And it's also a good tool for creating perspective, which is also great in creating depth, creating the feeling of space that we discussed about, and in leading the eye. The vanishing point method was used a lot during the Renaissance, and for that pretty much you just need some perspective and something far in the background, or something that's leading towards that point in the background, and just placing one element right at that point is going to draw pretty much all of your attention right there. So to summarize, now when we want to design, we want to make some kind of plan on how our artwork is gonna be, what kind of feeling we want to achieve with it, what kind of story we want to tell, how we want the viewer to look at the artwork. Now when you know these different things, when you start planning the next time, think first of the big form. Don't start with the details, but think of how you want to place things, what element you're going to be using, the broader scale of the thing. Because that's really when your designs start coming to really good life, instead of starting from the details here and there. Because if you start from the details, you're going to lose the big picture. It's so true, like even not only in the designing process, but it's true also in tattooing. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about that, even if I'm going to talk about it much more when we get into tattooing techniques. But when I started tattooing, I thought that I was doing really good realistic work, but obviously I could only see as far as my trained eye could see. And I really think that most of my artwork, even if it was technically okay, and it had a lot of details, a lot of texture, but it lacked depth. And you know why? Because when I started tattooing, I was just focused on the details so much that I forgot the big form. I forgot the big picture. They were fairly good artwork, and I don't think that pretty much any of the clients saw this, but this is something that, as I started tattooing in a little bit different way, I started getting more of these big forms and I didn't lose out on the big picture anymore, or getting lost in just the details and ending up with a very textured but flat image. So even when tattooing, I would say approach from the big form and keep that in mind while you're tattooing, but especially in the designing process, really keep the big picture in mind, what you want to do. Yep. Okay, so for homework, I would ask all of you to choose at least 5 paintings or tattoos or photographs, whatever form of artwork you want to study, and try to find some of the elements we have been talking about, or find what's missing or what's wrong, and pretty much try to understand, especially if it's a great artist you're looking at. I would recommend really studying Renaissance artists or some other great artist, and really try to figure out why they did certain things in different areas of the artwork. Because when you do this, your brain activates, and that's what we want to do now. We don't want to just leave this information be, we want to activate it. This is a big crucial step. I promise you, it's so crucial that you put this into work. But again, it's your choice. I can't sit here and force all of you to do anything. But I think it's well worth it if you want to take it serious and if you want to become as good as you could be. So think critically and systematically, and think why you think they have used certain things in their artwork, and why do you like it, why do you not like it. And the second part is, please do share with the community. You can even paste the pictures of the artwork, and you can paste underneath what you found curious, what you liked, what you didn't like, what you think the artist was thinking about. Also, putting this in writing is really going to help you as well. And the good thing is, if you put this out there, you're going to be helping a lot of other people who also read through your comments, and they're going to reflect on the same picture. They're going to reflect on what you're saying. And so I think that's really the power of the community, also just sharing the homework here, because so many other people can also benefit from it. So I'm putting my heart and soul into this project. I'm giving you guys a lot. So I hope that you can give a little bit back to all the community members. So if you feel it in your heart, share your homework. Don't be afraid. We're not here to judge each other. There's no wrong things here. This is just about studying, about being curious. So find paintings, find artwork, find photos, find tattoos, be curious, and try to think of the things that we discussed here today, and you will be much better off. Okay, thank you everybody.